Hey y'all, another late night message. Just got done doing a Bible study, and it was kind of stair stepping and walking through everything from Judas's betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane, all the way through Jesus dying on the cross, and that story being told through all of the Gospels. And something really stood out to me this time as I was reading it, and that is this idea that Jesus is utterly familiar with loneliness. He is completely aware of what it's like to be abandoned and alone and desperate and isolated. And I wonder on some level if he truly felt his human side, if he truly felt the pain of depression and probably anxiety on some level. In fact, I guess we know he dealt with anxiety as well, because just before all the events I'm about to talk about, it says that he was so stressed out in his final prayers to God in the garden that he was literally sweating blood. And so I guess it's safe to say that he dealt with, at the very least, a very heavy dose of situational anxiety. But tonight I really want to speak to those of you who struggle in this life and in this world with loneliness and depression, and how we have a God who chose to experience every level of humanity, including yours, including the darkness and pain of true isolation and loneliness and depression. So what I want to do for the next few minutes is just walk through a series of events that happened over basically a 24-hour period that shows how Jesus went from being a celebrity and being worshipped and praised and even acknowledged by many as eventually toward the end the Son of God, and how that completely got upended and turned on its head and the entire world abandoned him. So I want to start with the fact that immediately after praying to God several times in the garden with his disciples, mind you, Judas shows up, and he shows up with a mob of I don't know, I picture like Frankenstein or something, a mob of villagers with clubs and swords, it says. And I think the first painful moment is that Jesus is betrayed by one of his friends, by somebody in his inner circle who was Judas. He was one of the 12. And he's betrayed with a kiss, a sign of love, this fake, false sense of compassion or endearment that was really a betrayal in its deepest form. And so not only does it start with, his night starts with being betrayed by one of his closest friends through a sign of love, and then immediately being handed over to this mob, and he's arrested. He is arrested by this mob who are all wielding weapons, even though he has not committed a crime. He is completely innocent at this point, but regardless, they decide to take him in violently. And as this happens, the third thing is that in this moment of chaos, all the rest of his friends abandon him. And when I say the rest of his friends, the rest of the disciples, his closest core group of companions, all flee out of fear and panic and everything else. And Jesus is left falsely arrested and completely alone. We see that shortly after this, as he is drug into town and starts the process of being judged, for lack of better words, we see the four scene events of Peter, the most recognized and respected apostle, denying that he even knew who Jesus was, that he had any relationship with him whatsoever. And Peter denies him more or less in the same courtyard 3 times in a row, just outright refusing to acknowledge that he even knew who Jesus was, much less that he was his friend. So we see, in a way, Jesus's closest friend also deny him in this moment. After this happens, the crowds that I want to make note, just Sunday of this week, just a few days earlier, Jesus rode into town practically in a parade, being praised. People were singing, throwing their coats and palm branches on the road. There was just such an utter celebration of the fact that Jesus was coming into town. His celebrity was as apparent as probably it's ever been in Scripture. And so just a few days earlier, he is celebrated and praised as he enters town, and now he is being accused of blasphemy and all kinds of crimes, many of which conflicted with each other, and so the testimonies didn't even line up. And despite all of that, they're calling for his death for no reason. And the same crowds that were loving him just days earlier are now calling for him to die. A brutal death, mind you. He goes through a process bouncing between some of the major political leaders and Jewish leaders, the folks essentially judging him. And they find him innocent. Ironically, they basically say that they have found no wrong and that all of the charges against him were found to be false. And still yet, the Israelites, his people, and keep in mind, there are Roman enemies involved in some of this discussion, and yet it's the Israelites who are calling not only for his death, but they're choosing to release a known murderer, a convicted murderer, and give him freedom instead of Jesus. And when they ask what to do with Jesus, because he is innocent at this point, the Israelites, Jesus' people, instead of taking an easy route out, they could have just punished him, still for no reason, but they could have punished him and let him go. They chanted and called out for his crucifixion to the point that it was granted essentially just out of popular demand. It's not, more or less immediately following the crowd's wish being granted, we see almost immediately after granting the crowd's wishes by demand, we see Jesus go through a chain of brutal events that not only amplify the loneliness and depression and anxiety, but just raw physical torment as well, which is something that almost none of us are familiar with. We see that he initially is beaten mercilessly and mocked at the same time by an entire battalion of soldiers. And just picture that for a moment, like an entire battalion of soldiers, people who are trained in the art of war, who are scarily familiar with ways to inflict pain and even keep you alive while inflicting pain. And they brutally beat him, whip him, mock him, tear his body to utter shreds. He was already probably broken mentally, maybe spiritually, and now his body is being torn apart and broken as well. He then is forced to carry his own cross, a giant wooden cross, up a mountain, out of the city and up a mountain. And again, the irony, the dichotomy of entering the city a few days ago, by parade and praise, and now exiting the city, bleeding, destroyed, and people just watching as he carries his own instrument of death up a mountain after barely surviving torture. He is then crucified, and we know the story. He makes it up the mountain, obviously, and he is crucified, a form of death that was as cruel a punishment as the Roman Empire could come up with. It was meant to be brutal and long-lasting, and basically a slow form of suffocation that included a whole lot of pain in the midst of it. Kind of a public humiliation / death sentence. He is crucified, and he is mocked while on the cross by all the onlookers and the Pharisees and Israelites. He is spit on, he is humiliated, he's dying publicly in as a shameful a way as possible. And lastly, and maybe this is like the starkest point, that throughout all of this we acknowledge that Jesus is kind of superhuman. He was both fully man but also fully God, and so it would be really easy to, I don't know why you would, but it'd be really easy to almost downplay what he was going through, associating with him some kind of supernatural ability to endure pain and suffering. So even if you believe that, even if you believe like he's still got God, because you'd be right, up until this point, even though the entire world, literally the entire world, has turned on him, other than maybe his mother and a few women who were still loyal followers, he still had God. And that didn't last either. You see, the thing about the cross, and Jesus knew this, and I think this is where so much of the anxiety came from, is that he knew that on the cross, in order to accomplish what he came to do, he didn't just have to live the perfect life pre-cross, he also had to become our sacrificial lamb. And that meant carrying the full weight of all of humanity's sin, past, present, and future. And so while on the cross, after everything that he's gone through, he's broken spiritually, emotionally, physically, all of it. Unfortunately, it's in this last moment that God himself has to turn his back on Jesus. And Jesus, who had closer a relationship to God than any man who's walked the earth, who, was literally God's child, has his Father turn his back. Not because God didn't love Jesus, but because the only way to accomplish salvation was for God to lay all of that sin on Jesus's perfect shoulders and let him die alone, bearing all of it. And that's hard for me to imagine, just quite literally losing everything in that moment. And he knows he's going to conquer it, but he still has to go through it as a human being. And it's awful and it's painful. And you see Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And crying out one last time as he offers up his spirit to death. And I don't want to end on some dark note, because I know this feels like a super, super dark message, but there's really a ton of hope here, because here's the thing. We know that 3 days later, on the third day, Jesus conquers death. Jesus descends into hell. He overcomes death itself and becomes our gateway to salvation, our gateway to an eternity of peace and connection back with God. And the beauty is he is credited with not just being an awesome God and an awesome Savior, but also being a human being who could relate to us. He is a God who actually knows what it's like to walk on our shoes. And so again, some of you, are dealing with some heavy loneliness. Some of you feel like you're mentally broken, emotionally broken, spiritually broken, maybe even physically broken, depending on what your circumstances are. And here's the thing, Jesus knows exactly what it's like in your shoes, and he's saying, I've got you. You're going to get through this. Trust in me. Come walk with me. And not only will I be a form of support that nobody on this earth, in this universe, can offer to you, not only will I be that for you in the here and now, but I offer you an eternity fixed, an eternity restored, an eternity of peace and wholeness and fulfillment and happiness and restoration. And what greater message could I give to you tonight than that? That you have a God who knows the darkest of the dark moments that this world has to offer. And he chose to go through it all and take it all just for you. For you. And he is calling out to you saying, everything I have for you, the gift of salvation, complete restoration, it's free. I did it all for you, and I did it all because I love you. And I want to save you and restore you from this sin-soaked world so that eternity of peace and happiness can be yours too. That's some good news. I hope that this message, somebody needed to hear it. I guarantee you somebody needed to hear it. If this message was for you, I'm glad that you checked in tonight and you were able to join me, whether it's tonight, tomorrow, whatever the case is. I'm glad that you were able to experience this message in some way. If you know somebody who needs to hear this message, I pray that you share it. This ministry is just getting started, and so like the video, share the video, follow the ministry. I know that God's going to use this for great things, but the word has to get out in order for that to happen. And so this isn't about money or anything like that. I'm not collecting donations or tithe. I'm not affiliated with a church. This is just free volunteer effort, feeling like God has put a word in my mouth for the world to hear. So I love y'all. I pray that you have a great night, and we'll see you soon.